Obney is the Chief Technology Officer at Paystar, a company likely involved in payment processing or financial technology. By the way, ChatGPT wrote that bio. Justin.
All right. Hey, everybody. Justin Obney. I think we can all agree context is important. And so I'd like to start with a little. Been an engineer for about 15 years, not trained in education, not trained in AI and machine learning. I have two little girls, Riley and Rowan, 4 and 6, and like they're learning right now. They're learning to read. And kind of what I'm going to share is like in April, that's kind of when a lot of stuff clicked for me with my girls, and it's just been kind of off to the races after that. I do have two companies I'm heavily involved in, Paystar and Elevator 3, and so I don't have a ton of time outside of that and my kids. And so a lot of what I've done, I've placed some constraints, like staying just in ChatGPT, and I know that ignores a lot of things. That ignores the vibrant ecosystem out there of all the tools that are coming out. But it also aids in a lot of other stuff. By placing kind of constraints on kind of what I was getting into, it allowed me to kind of jump in and find some really interesting things. And I think that's also where I really started to get excited, is because what I was kind of seeing with those constraints really, when I would think about it, like, man, when we start applying system engineering, product engineering, and all that stuff to what we're able to get just out of this technology, I kind of couldn't look away. And if you know me, if you've talked to me, if you talk to my wife, I kind of been talking about all of this stuff a lot since about April. And the biggest thing that I've been trying to figure out when I talk to people is you tell them or you show them this amazing thing, and they're like, man, that's great. And then they kind of just like look away. And you're like, man, how do they look away? And so like, because I that's the tough part. And so that's what I've been trying to figure out. And I kind of just start with how it kind of happened. And for me, that moment was like in April, driving back with my girls, which absolutely AI generated image. The first one had like, I guess it assumed I was my wife. She was facing backwards, and like the other one had me like driving and reading a paper. I was like, nope, let's not put that one up there. And so I was driving home, and I was talking to my 6-year-old, and I was like, hey, what'd you do at school today? And she was like, nothing. I was like, all right, cool. And she's like, well, we did read this book, Peter's Chair. And I was like, all right. Popped open my phone. I was like, hey, let me check out this ChatGPT thing. Talking to my girl, and I'm like, hey, did Peter get sad? And she's like, yeah. And I was like, what happened? Well, he was going to have a little brother. I was like, man, what made him sad? And she was like, well, he's going to give his toys away. And I was like, did he stay sad? And she was like, no, not really. I was like, what happened? Well, he painted the chair with his dad, and that was a great thing. And I was like, man, we just went from, what did you do today? Nothing, to this conversation about like how your world is changing and how you're coping with those feelings and how ultimately something good came out of it. And that was like, I was like, okay, this is probably a lot more to this than meets the eye. And so then that Saturday, and you'll probably hear a lot more about this by people that are actually educators, that are actually machine learning and AI kind of experts, but this was kind of where my eyes were opening. I like popped open ChatGPT. I was like, let me see what we can do with this thing. And so I'll kind of narrate these, but I was like, hey, we're going to talk to Riley. We're going to talk about Peter's Chair. And what I wanted to do is like, she's learning to read. And so I was like, man, I bet I can just get her to read this stuff as it's streaming in. And so she starts reading, what's going on. And I was like, hey, I want you to give it some pieces so I can narrate, which kind of, as all of you have heard today, having someone in the loop is definitely a key point to all of this. And so as another disclaimer, all of my effort has really just been about the possibility, not necessarily the myriad of other things that we're definitely going to have to solve. And so that's where I kept going. And immediately when I was doing this, I was like, hey, words like jealous are too hard for her. And it was like, all right, I got you. And then we kept going, and she's reading as we're doing this. And I was like, man, she's learning to read. This is great. And then I was like, hey, she hit some words. It's like, put the phonetic pronunciation next to it. And so I'm teaching my daughter. I'm like, hey, this is how it's spelled, and this is how you say it. And then we're doing that, and very next time, and I'll play this, I don't know if you have audio, but if this is like just a couple seconds. No, you don't have audio. She said they didn't put the lines, so I couldn't read it. And I was like, 30 seconds ago, you didn't know what phonetic pronunciation was, and now you're mad that this magic system didn't immediately give you this tool to make your learning that much easier. And this was, again, was in April. And then, like, that's where it really, I was like, okay, what else can we do with this? And so I started, like, trying to learn about learning. And so the more and more I kind of got in that, the more and more I thought about it, I kind of remember my early thoughts was like, man, I think the key is just an analogy. And what I kind of meant by that was, if I say, how does AI work? I bet all of you could come up with an analogy. Some of you very wrong. Some of you wildly better in here than most of us. But ultimately, the analogy was kind of concrete in your head. And I was like, oh, that's kind of great, because if we can start with that analogy, we can start walking towards where we're trying to go. And so we can say, here's my analogy, show me what this analogy means in this new area, and we're kind of in the safety of our analogy, but we're learning this new info. Through diving in, I kind of learned, oh, this is called like the zone of proximal development, which is like the most you can learn needing just a little bit of help, so you keep going. And the more and more I kind of dove into this, throughout all this time, I'm diving in with ChatGPT only, and I have lots of fun threads that I can show after that really kind of highlight a lot of this stuff. And the more and more we did it, the more and more I would notice my girls are starting to like pick up lots of things, and they're starting to learn through these interactions. And the whole time, I just keep having this idea in my head of like, I'm using nothing more than ChatGPT with the constraints that that product has put upon me. And every day I'm going to work and we're solving massive systems problems and using all these tools. And it was like, man, when those two come together, really what's going to be possible for our kids? And all this is definitely coupled at the same time with a lot of these, you can't use ChatGPT for this, or you can't do that. And then it was like immediately a fear of like, oh man, when this stuff really comes together, where do I want my girls to be? I want them to be understanding of the risks of all this, but absolutely prepared in kind of jumping forward and starting to use this. And so what I've started doing is trying to figure out, how do we kind of continue to really pull this in? One of the fun things we started doing, and this isn't quite with my 4 and 6-year-old, it started with them, but it quickly jumped into me. I started and I was like, okay, let's do this thing. I was like, hey, we're playing with Legos. And I started and I was like, hey, give me some ideas for some Legos. And it gives it to me. And again, it's very important. A lot of it was wrong. And like if you looked at my title slide, it was like all the words and all that was terrible. It's like, hey, we're used to using imperfect things to get 1000x returns. And so like, what's really different here? And so I started, I said, give me some Legos. I did that and I was like, can you give me like a notation for this? And it gives me like this ASCII notation of like what a front-facing perspective is. And like we're sitting there and I was like, man, I bet we can visualize this with HTML and CSS. And then I was like, can you give me that? And it's like, here you go. And I was like, can you give it to me in JavaScript? And it was like, here you go. And I was like, can you teach me about structural integrity? And it was like, here's some rules about structural integrity. Then I was like, can you write a function to verify those rules of structural integrity? And it's like, here you go. Is the block floating? Is it a valid width? And every key aspect, it was just that synaptic plasticity, that kind of building that muscle memory to try these wild things to see what's possible, but also not being constrained by the fact that there were lots of broken things, was really what kind of kept opening my eyes to what was possible. And I know I've got like 4 more minutes. So the biggest piece since then has been that while I kind of quickly understood its learning in general, because I quickly started pulling this to myself. Like I got really interested in AI, and I was like, hey, let's start using the AI to teach me about AI. All the stuff's happening in Python. And so I was like, hey, I'm an engineer. I don't really know Python that well, but I bet I can learn it fast. And I started doing things like saying, hey, give me some example code, ask me 3 questions, let me answer 3 times. I'll respond, figure out where my holes are. And ultimately, it kind of all came together in like a notebook that I kind of call Project Kung Fu, because in that moment I was like, oh, I know Kung Fu. Like, I can learn anything. And so for those of y'all have seen The Matrix and are old enough, like, that's like, we're really there right now. And so it's really exciting when I kind of come up and I hear all the people doing all of this stuff. And when it comes to like, how can we be prepared and how can we best position ourselves, I think kind of accepting and understanding what's coming and really being positioned is that answer. And I think that sure, there's lots of things we have to solve, undoubtedly. But I think like the single biggest thing we can do to kind of move that forward is like start interacting with it now, start touching it right now. I know it's scary, and ultimately you kind of quickly drop into these discussions of like, oh, is it going to take our jobs away, and what's it going to do here, and what's it going to, and those are all very valid discussions. The reason that this kind of kept keeping my attention was, while they're both valid, if it does somehow happen, the way I would kind of look at it is like, well, if we don't have to go to work, what's kind of left to work on other than like ourselves? And so it's kind of like, okay, is this just a way to kind of keep building ourselves up? And so I guess my biggest kind of call to action, which has been replicated here, is you should definitely get out there and you should be touching it. You shouldn't be afraid of necessarily it being wrong. You should be afraid of missing out this unique opportunity that we have at this point in time. And you should get used to asking it to do things that you don't think it's going to do, because if you don't ask it those questions, you're just going to kind of be limiting what can come out of it. And so being, getting into finance, one of the things we would always hear was like, time in the market always beats timing the market. And so when I kind of had my 4 and 6-year-old, which is definitely my major motivation in kind of jumping into all this, and I kind of looked at the opportunity for their life, and if kind of we start utilizing these tools now and kind of putting it in front of them, like, there's nothing really more I could ask for. And so these days it's pretty funny, because with the voice ChatGPT, we kind of started doing this thing where we'll start talking to it, and it's very funny to hear, or rather to watch them learn, because what I kind of found underneath all this was, at its core, it's all communication. And accessibility itself is effectively breaking down those barriers to communicate what they want to know, what they want to do, or anybody like that. And that's kind of what I see under a lot of this, is tearing down the barriers of communication. First, like first and foremost between a person and a computer, but ultimately it's in pursuit of helping other people. So sure, the computer's right there in the middle, but really it's about breaking that communication barrier so that you can communicate what all the other people are trying to achieve and help them kind of go that way. So that's just my story of kind of what I'm doing and why I'm super excited in all this. And I can't get past the fact that, like, I didn't use any of the tools to do anything crazy. I just kept saying, try harder. And in my AI research, I kind of came back to the talk the paper in 2017, that kind of the Transformer paper, and then I was like, oh, it's literally titled "All You Need Is Attention," and I was like, that's kind of the answer to like what we're looking at right here. Is like, if you have the attention, which if you have a 4 and 6-year-old, there's lots of attention there. Like, how can we really capitalize on that attention to find out what's possible? So, thank you.